The morning I decided to stop being a decent man, I was elbow deep in a clogged grease trap at the Elks Lodge on Route 9. That's not metaphor, that's Tuesday. I'm a licensed plumber. Been one for 19 years in Hardin County, Kentucky. My name is Owen Friel, and I know where every septic line, well casing, and storm drain runs between Elizabethtown and Radcliffe because I've laid half of them and repaired the other half. My hands smell like PVC primer more days than they don't. I drive a 2011 F250 with 214,000 miles and a toolbox bolted to the bed that weighs more than some of my customers' wives. I have a 14-year-old daughter named Maggie who thinks I'm boring, and she's mostly right. I have an ex-wife in Bowling Green who sends me texts that start with, "Per my last message, I'm a vendor she's trying to terminate." I have a Beagle Lab mix named Doug who rides shotgun and sheds on every surface science has yet invented. What I did not have on that Tuesday was any reason to believe the world was about to develop a problem that plumbing could not fix. I was underneath the Elks Lodge floor, flashlight clamped in my teeth, when my phone buzzed 7 times in a row. Ignored it. 8th buzz. 9th. I pulled my arm out of the trap, came away trailing something I will not describe to you, and checked the screen with my clean hand. 6 texts from my brother-in-law, Dale, who works infection control at Hardin Memorial. Dale is not a man who texts. Dale is a man who calls once on Thanksgiving, asks if the Wildcats won, and hangs up before you finish answering. 6 consecutive texts from Dale was the equivalent of a flare gun. The first one said, "Owen, don't go home yet, call me." The second, "Seriously, call me right now." 3rd through 5th were links to something on a CDC subdomain I'd never seen. Not the public-facing site, but what looked like an internal memo that had gotten loose. The page loaded slow on my signal down there, and what came through was dense with jargon. Phrases like rapid onset necrotizing encephalitis, and ambulatory post-mortem aggression patterns, and transmission via fluid contact with reanimated subjects. The 6th text was the one that mattered. Dale had typed it carefully, no abbreviations, which for a man who writes instead of your was like watching someone put on a suit for court. They are going to quarantine the county. I have seen the patients. They are not patients anymore. You have maybe 30 days before the roads close. I'm telling you this because of Maggie. Please listen to me for once in your life. I sat on the concrete floor of the Elks Lodge crawl space, smelling decades of cooking grease and mildew, and read that message 4 times. Then I called Dale, and he picked up on the first ring, and the sound of his voice was something I'd never heard from him before. Dale had been Army. Dale had done 2 tours in Iraq. Dale did not rattle. Dale was rattling. He talked for 11 minutes. I didn't interrupt once, which if you knew me, you'd understand was its own kind of miracle. What he described was this. Hardin Memorial had received 9 patients in 48 hours presenting with identical symptoms: high fever, then sudden drop to subnormal temperature, violent seizures, then a period of apparent death. No pulse, no respiration, pupils fixed and dilated, lasting between 4 and 19 minutes. Then the patients got back up. They did not get back up the way people get back up. Dale said the word bite 6 times. He said they had to restrain 4 times. He said one phrase that I will hear for the rest of whatever life I have left. Owen, the dead one, bit through a leather wrist strap and took 2 fingers off a nurse I've worked with for 11 years. And when we sedated it, the sedative did nothing, because you cannot sedate a body that has no blood pressure. I asked him how long we had. He said the containment would hold maybe 3 weeks, 4 if they were lucky. The Kentucky National Guard was already being briefed. The plan was to seal Hardin County along the existing highway checkpoints: Route 31 west to the north, I-65 at the interchange, 62 to the east, and the County Line Road to the south. Once sealed, nobody in, nobody out. They were calling it a disease management perimeter Dale did not call it that. Dale called it a wall with us on the wrong side of it. I asked him if he was leaving. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said he couldn't. He'd taken an oath, and the patients, the real patients, the ones who were just sick and scared, they needed someone who understood sterile protocol. He told me to take Maggie and go. And I told him I couldn't leave the county because Maggie's mother had primary custody, and Maggie was at school in Radcliffe, and the custody agreement said I couldn't take her across county lines without written consent. He said, "Owen, there is not going to be a custody agreement. There's going to be alive and not alive. Pick one." I sat there for a long time after we hung up. Doug was in the truck above me, probably asleep on the passenger seat with his nose against the vent. Somewhere in the lodge above, someone was running a vacuum cleaner. The grease trap was still clogged. The world was still for another few minutes. A place where clogged grease traps mattered. Then I climbed out, wiped my hands on my jeans, and drove to my daughter's school. Here is what you need to understand about Hardin County, Kentucky, if you're going to understand why I did what I did and didn't do what I didn't. It's Fort Knox country. Has been since 1918. Half the economy is military adjacent, barbers and bars and pawn shops and apartments renting to enlisted families rotating through. The gold vault is there, though nobody talks about it the way outsiders expect. It's just a building you drive past. The county is limestone karst underneath, which means caves and sinkholes and well water that tastes like chalk if you don't filter it. Rolling hills, tobacco fields going to seed since the buyout, creeks that flood every spring and go dry every August. About 110,000 people spread across a county that's mostly rural once you get outside the E-Town corridor. I knew the water infrastructure because I'd worked on it. I knew which developments were on city water and which were on wells. I knew which neighborhoods had basements that flooded and which sat on bedrock. I knew where the old storm shelters were from the Cold War era, because I'd been called to fix frozen pipes in 3 of them. I knew the county the way a plumber knows a body, not the way it looks on the outside, but the way it runs underneath, where the joints are weak and the pressure builds, and the whole thing is one bad fitting from catastrophe. Maggie was in second period algebra when I walked into Radcliffe Middle School and told the front office I had a family emergency. They called her down. She came around the corner with her backpack half-zipped and her earbuds still in, and that expression 14-year-olds have perfected, the one that says, "Whatever this is, it's interrupting something more important." I told her in the truck, not everything. Enough. I told her Dale had called, that there was a serious illness at the hospital, that things might get difficult for a while, and that she was going to stay with me for a few weeks. She asked if her mom knew. I said I'd handle it. She asked if she could bring her cat. I said the cat was at her mom's house in Bowling Green, and we weren't going to Bowling Green. She stared at me the way she does when she's deciding whether I'm being dramatic or serious. Then she put her earbuds back in and looked out the window. I had $11,400 in savings. I had the truck. I had a 3-bedroom ranch house on 2 acres outside Cecilia with a well, a propane tank, a detached garage, and a root cellar my grandfather had dug in 1961 because he believed Kennedy was going to get us all killed. I had 19 years of knowing how water moves and where pipes fail and what happens to a house when systems stop working. I did not have 30 days. I had 30 days if Dale was right. If Dale was optimistic, I had less. I gave myself 21 and started spending money I'd been saving for Maggie's braces. First stop was Rural King on Ring Road. I bought 50-pound bags of white rice, 8 of them, 400 pounds total, 640,000 calories at 1,600 per pound. At 2,000 calories a day for 2 people. That's 160 days of base nutrition if we ate nothing else. I bought 30 cans of black beans, 20 cans of corn, a case of peanut butter, salt, sugar, powdered milk, and multivitamins, because rice and beans will keep you alive, but they won't keep your teeth in your head without vitamin C. The girl at checkout, her name tag said Kendra, looked at my cart and said, "Storm coming?" I said, "Something like that." She didn't ask more. This is Kentucky. People stock up. It's not remarkable until it is. Second stop was the Cecilia Hardware, where I bought rolls of 8-gauge wire fencing, a post-hole digger, though I already owned one. 16 cedar posts, a deadbolt set, and 3 sheets of half-inch plywood. Randy behind the counter asked if I was fencing in a garden, and I said yes. And he told me the deer would jump anything under 8 feet, and I said I wasn't worried about deer. Third stop was Don's Firearms on North Dixie. I already owned a Remington 8.7 012-gauge 5-shelled tube, 1 in the chamber, 6 total, which I'd used for dove hunting with a frequency that embarrassed actual hunters. I bought a case of double-aught buckshot, a case of number 4 shot, a Glock 19 because it's what everyone recommends, and I am not creative about firearms, 4 boxes of 9mm, and a cleaning kit. The background check took 40 minutes. I stood in that shop with my hands in my pockets and my heart doing something I won't describe to you. And I thought about what kind of man buys a handgun on a Tuesday afternoon because his brother-in-law told him dead people are biting nurses. The kind of man with a 14-year-old daughter. That's what kind. I spent $4,200 that first day. Nearly 40% of everything I had. When I got home and started unloading the truck, Maggie stood on the porch with Doug pressed against her leg and watched me carry in bag after bag. She didn't say anything until I came through the door with the ammunition. Then she said, "Dad, what is actually happening?" I sat down on the porch steps, and I told her everything Dale had told me, because she was 14 and not stupid. And the one thing my ex-wife was right about was that I underestimated our daughter at every possible opportunity. Maggie listened. Then she said, "So it's zombies." And I said, "Dale didn't use that word." And she said, "Dale's an adult. Adults don't use the right words for things. It's zombies." She wasn't wrong. She usually isn't. The next 6 days were the strangest of my life up to that point. Because the world was still working. That's the part nobody prepares you for. The gas stations were open, the grocery stores were stocked. People went to work. Maggie's school sent a robocall about picture day. The cognitive dissonance of buying plywood to barricade your windows while your neighbor mows his lawn in cargo shorts. It does something to your sense of reality that I don't have a clean word for. I worked the problem the way I'd work a whole house repipe. Start with the main line. Branch out. Don't skip steps because skipping steps means tearing open a wall you just closed. Water first. My well ran on an electric pump. If power failed, we had nothing. I drove to Lowe's in Elizabethtown and bought a hand pump conversion kit. A simple pump rated for static water levels down to 325 feet. My well was 180 feet deep with a static level around 40 feet. I could install it myself alongside the existing submersible. Took me a full day. Maggie held the flashlight while I worked the wellhead, and she asked questions I didn't expect. Practical ones, like how many gallons per minute and whether we should fill the bathtubs now while the electric pump still worked. I told her yes. We filled both bathtubs, the washing machine, and every pot and jar in the kitchen. Somewhere around 60 gallons total for immediate use, with the hand pump as our long-term source. Propane tank was at 60%, roughly 300 gallons in a 500-gallon tank, at conservative use. Cooking only, no heating. That would last months. If we needed heat, weeks. It was late October. Kentucky winters are not Montana winters, but they'll kill you if you're careless. Average January low in Hardin County is around 25 degrees. I started cutting firewood from the deadfall at the back of my property. Oak and hickory mostly, already seasoned from standing dead. I stacked it against the garage wall under a tarp. The fencing went up around the house in a rough perimeter. Not a fortress, nothing that would stop a determined human, but enough to slow down anything moving without fine motor coordination. I set the posts 3 feet deep in the limestone soil, which was brutal work, My shoulders ached in a way that felt ancestral, like my body was remembering something my desk job generation was supposed to have forgotten. On day 8, I met Vera. I was at the Rural King again. More canned goods, lamp oil, a water filter, and there was a woman in the camping aisle holding a Sawyer water filter in one hand and a life straw in the other, comparing them with the expression of someone doing math under pressure. She was mid-60s, black, gray hair cut close, wearing a Hardin Memorial ID badge she'd forgotten to take off. The badge said, Vera Okonkwo, RN. I said, the Sawyer. Filters more volume. The life straw is for individual use. She looked at me the way nurses look at people who offer unsolicited medical opinions. Then she looked at my cart. Rice, batteries, duct tape, a machete, and something shifted in her face. You talked to someone at the hospital, she said. It wasn't a question. I told her about Dale. She closed her eyes for a moment. And when she opened them, the professional mask was gone, and what was behind it was a woman who had seen something she could not process while standing in a sporting goods aisle. I've been a nurse for 38 years, she said. I've done ER, ICU, hospice. I have watched more people die than you have watched football games. And I have never... She stopped, adjusted the reading glasses on her nose. The one in Bay 4 sat up. It sat up, Owen. The monitor was flatline. I was filling out the time of death. And it sat up and looked at me like I was something to eat. We stood in that aisle for 20 minutes. She told me she lived alone. Husband died in 2019, kids in Atlanta and Chicago, neither answering her calls because neither believed what she was telling them. She had a townhouse in the Woodland Hills development east of E-Town. City water, no generator, no basement. I told her she was welcome at my place. She said she didn't know me. I said I didn't know her either, but I knew she was a nurse and I was a plumber, and between the two of us, we could keep people hydrated and alive, and that seemed like enough of a resume. She bought the Sawyer. She followed me home in a silver Camry packed to the headliner with medical supplies she'd taken from the hospital supply closet on her way out. And she did not apologize for taking them. And I did not ask her to. Day 14. The news caught up to reality. It came piecemeal, the way it always does now. Not a single broadcast, but an accumulation of clips and posts and secondhand reports that assembled into a picture nobody wanted to see. A cell phone video from the Hardin Memorial parking lot showed 2 National Guard soldiers restraining something in a hospital gown. The something moved wrong, hips and knees and shoulders bending at angles that were not angles a living person would choose, because choice requires a brain that weighs consequences, and this thing's brain had been rewired for one function only. The governor held a press conference. He used the phrase aggressive pathogen and temporary containment zone. He did not use the word Maggie had used. Adults don't use the right words for things. By day 16, the checkpoints were up. Not the full quarantine. That came later, but advisory roadblocks on 31W and the I-65 interchange. Soldiers waving people through but writing down license plates. The message was clear, even if the words weren't. We are watching who leaves. On day 18, the first local incident I witnessed with my own eyes, I was driving back from a final supply run. Propane adapter fittings, of all things, because the ones I had were corroded and a gas leak during a zombie apocalypse struck me as an unnecessarily stupid way to die. I was on 1600 heading south toward Cecilia when I saw Earl Pruitt's cattle in the road. Earl had a 100-acre beef operation 2 miles from my place. Herefords, mostly. Good fences. His cattle did not get out. I slowed down. 6 cows standing in the road, not moving the way cows move when they've wandered through a gap. Bunched together, heads low, the posture of animals that have been chased. I pulled around them and drove another quarter mile and found the fence down, not fallen, torn. A section of welded wire panel ripped from the T-posts and folded back like someone had peeled it. was in his yard. Or what had been Earl was in his yard. He was face down near the stock tank, and something was crouched over him. And I'm going to tell you what I saw because you are listening to this, and you deserve the truth. But I'm going to tell it simply because the details don't need to be lingered over. It was his farmhand, Miguel. I'd met Miguel twice. Quiet kid, early 20s, good with the cattle. Miguel's skin was the color of wet concrete. His mouth was not a mouth anymore. It was a mechanism. And Earl was no longer a person to whom things could be done, because everything that could be done had been done. I sat in my truck with the engine running and the Glock 19 on the seat beside me, and I did nothing. For what felt like an hour, but was probably 90 seconds, I did nothing. Because knowing intellectually that the dead are walking is a different country from watching it happen 40 yards from your windshield. And I had not yet crossed the border. Then Miguel stood up and turned, and that gray face oriented on my truck the way a satellite dish orients on a signal. Not with intelligence, not with malice, but with a mechanical certainty that was worse than either. I put the truck in reverse and backed down 1,600 until I could turn around. I drove home at 70 miles an hour on a road rated for 45. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the cab, and I couldn't make my hands release the steering wheel, because my hands had decided independently that letting go meant acknowledging what I'd seen, and my hands were not ready. Maggie came out to the porch. She saw my face and did not ask. She just sat down next to the truck on the gravel with Doug in her lap and waited. I'm not proud that my daughter had to wait for her father to remember how to function, but she did, and eventually I did. And I went inside and loaded the Remington and leaned it against the wall by the front door, and it stayed there from that night on, like a permanent member of the household. Vera changed the house, not physically, though she reorganized the kitchen with a ruthlessness that suggested deep opinions about how civilian men store canned goods. She changed the atmosphere. She prayed in the mornings, quietly, in the guest room, and the murmur of it came through the walls like a frequency just below hearing. She made inventory lists, with the penmanship of someone trained when penmanship was still a discipline. She taught Maggie how to take a pulse, how to clean a wound, how to recognize the signs of shock. She treated my daughter like a colleague, not a child, and Maggie responded by becoming someone I almost didn't recognize. Focused, methodical, serious in a way that made my chest ache, because 14-year-olds should not have to be serious like that. On day 20, Nolan showed up. I say showed up like it was casual. It was not. I was reinforcing the perimeter fence with a second line of wire when I heard an engine on the county road. Unusual by then, because fuel was becoming something people thought about before spending. A black Silverado pulled up to my driveway and sat there idling. I picked up the Remington. The driver's door opened, and a man got out with his hands visible and his palms forward. He was early 50s, thick build, buzz cut going white at the temples, wearing a faded army jacket with no insignia. He said, "You Owen Friel? Dale sent me." His name was Nolan Reese, retired Master Sergeant, 22 years. Most of it spent at Fort Knox in various capacities he described vaguely enough that I understood he'd done things he wasn't going to detail. He'd been living in a cabin on Rough River Lake since his retirement, fishing and apparently drinking enough to concern Dale, who'd been his AA sponsor for 3 years. Dale had called him the same day he'd called me, with the same message. Nolan had spent 2 weeks fortifying his cabin before concluding that a lakeshore position with 3 exposed approaches was, in his words, a geometric death sentence. Dale had told him to find me. I did not trust him immediately. I trusted Dale, and Dale trusted Nolan. But transitive trust is a loan, not a gift. It has to be repaid through evidence. The evidence came fast. Nolan walked my property for an hour and came back with observations that restructured my entire defensive thinking. The tree line to the north was too close, 50 yards. Enough cover for anything to approach unseen. The root cellar had one entrance, which made it a shelter but also a coffin. The propane tank was exposed from the road, and a single round from a hunting rifle would turn my heating supply into a fireball. He said these things, not with condescension, but with the clinical specificity of someone who had spent decades evaluating positions for exactly these variables. I asked him what he'd do. He said we needed a fallback, somewhere with elevation, limited approaches, solid structure. He'd noticed the Cecilia Baptist Church on the hill a half-mile south. Stone foundation, brick walls, bell tower with a 360-degree sight line, spring-fed well in the churchyard that had been covered with a concrete cap but was still viable. He knew this because he'd hunted the property behind it for 15 years and had drunk from that spring more than once. That church became the plan, not immediately. My house was still viable as a primary position. But if things deteriorated past the point where a ranch house with wire fencing could hold, we had somewhere to go. Nolan started making trips to the church, quietly evaluating the structure, clearing the well cap, staging supplies in the basement where Sunday school classrooms gathered dust. On day 23, our last member arrived, and she arrived the hard way. I heard a sound at 2 in the morning that I identified as human because Doug identified it first. He went to the door not barking, but whining, which was worse. I opened the front door with the Remington and a flashlight and found a girl on my porch steps, 17 maybe, thin in the way that precedes thin, not yet starving, but heading there with conviction. She was holding a tire iron in one hand and clutching her left arm to her chest, and even in flashlight, I could see the arm was wrong. Broken. The radius, Vera would later confirm. A clean fracture, which was the only lucky thing about it. Her name was Josie Kilpatrick. She'd been a senior at North Hardin High. She'd been at a friend's house in Vine Grove when the friend's father turned. She described it without effect, the way you recite a grocery list you've memorized. He'd gotten sick. He'd died. He'd come back. She'd run. She'd been walking for 2 days. The arm had happened when she fell off a fence in the dark. Nolan didn't want her inside. He said it out loud, standing in my living room at 2:15 in the morning. And I am recording this because he was not wrong to say it, and I was not wrong to overrule him. His reasoning was operational. We didn't know her. We didn't know if she'd been bitten. She was an additional mouth requiring an additional day, which cut our supply window by 20%. My reasoning was simpler. She was 17. She was hurt. The alternative to opening my door was leaving a child in the dark with a broken arm and a tire iron. And I was not going to be the man who chose arithmetic over a kid on his porch. Vera set the arm with a splint fashioned from a wooden spoon and an ACE bandage. Maggie gave Josie a sweatshirt. Doug slept at the foot of her bed, which he had never done for anyone but Maggie. And my daughter noticed this and said nothing, and her silence on the subject was the most generous thing she'd done in her 14 years. Days 24 through 28 compressed into a rhythm that felt almost domestic, and the almost was what made it unbearable. Mornings, water retrieval from the hand pump, 30 pumps per gallon, 5 gallons per person per day for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. 25 gallons total. My shoulder learned to ache in a new key. Maggie and Josie took turns when I couldn't. Vera rationed from the medical supplies with an attention to detail that bordered on religious. Every bandage logged, every ibuprofen tablet accounted for, every alcohol swab noted in the margin of a composition notebook she'd brought from the hospital. Nolan ran what he called dawn patrols, walking the perimeter at first light with the Glock. I'd given it to him because he could hit things with it and I could not. And ego has no place in survival. He reported what he saw. One reanimated in the tree line on day 25, moving east, not oriented on us. A column of smoke from the Pruitt farm on day 26 that burned for 9 hours and nobody came to put it out. 2 gunshots from the direction of Cecilia on day 27, spaced 4 seconds apart. The interval of someone aiming rather than panicking. The quarantine went full on day 25. The advisory roadblocks became concrete barriers and razor wire and soldiers who were authorized, according to the emergency broadcast. to use lethal force against anyone attempting to cross the containment perimeter. Hardin County was sealed. 110,000 people locked inside with an infection that turned the dead into mechanisms and the living into prey. Cell service died the same day. Whether it was infrastructure failure or intentional shutdown, I never learned. The last text I received was from my ex-wife, Colleen. It said, "Is Maggie safe?" I typed back, "Yes, I have her. I won't let anything happen to her." I don't know if it's sent. The spinning wheel was still going when the signal dropped, and it stayed spinning for 3 days until the phone battery died, and I couldn't justify running the generator to charge it. Food math became the scaffold of our days. 5 people, rice, beans, canned goods, peanut butter. I sat at the kitchen table on day 26 and did the calculation honestly for the first time. We had roughly 80 days of food at 2,000 calories per person per day. 80 days sounds like a lot. It is not a lot when you don't know if day 81 will bring relief or just day 81. Josie surprised me. She surprised all of us. Once the splint was on and the pain had dulled to something she could carry, she became the most relentless worker in the house. She organized the root cellar into zones: dry goods, medical, tools, water storage, with a logic that Vera called better than most hospital supply rooms I've managed. She repaired the broken hinge on the cellar door using a nail and a strip of aluminum can. A fix I would have done differently, but that worked. And working is the only metric that survives scrutiny. She also didn't talk about what happened in Vine Grove. Not once. The absence of the story sat in the house like furniture we all navigated around. The conflict came on day 27. And it came from where I should have expected it. Nolan wanted to scout the surrounding properties for additional supplies. His argument was sound. The Pruitt farm had a machine shop with tools we could use. The abandoned houses on 1600 might have canned goods and ammunition and fuel. Resources unguarded were resources wasted. I said no. I said taking from our neighbors' homes, even abandoned ones, was looting. And if those neighbors came back, they'd come back to nothing because of us. Nolan looked at me with an expression that contained no contempt, but absolute certainty. "Owen, Earl Pruitt is dead. I can see his barn from the north tree line. Nothing is moving on that property except things that used to be people. His tools are doing nothing. His diesel is doing nothing. We are 4 adults and a child trying to survive on politeness and rice. And politeness is a currency that just got devalued to 0. Maggie was in the room. She said, "He's right, Dad." That landed somewhere in my ribs. Not because she was wrong. Because she was 14 and she was right. And the world that made her right was a world I had failed to prevent. We went to the Pruitt farm the next morning, Nolan and I. We found diesel. 20 gallons in a drum. A chainsaw with a fresh chain, fencing tools, a case of .30-06 ammunition that fit nothing we owned, but that Nolan said was currency. We did not go in the house. The sound from inside the house was enough to know that whatever was in there had been Earl's wife. And we left it, because some doors you do not open. I left a note on Earl's workbench. I know how that sounds. I left a note on a dead man's workbench, apologizing for taking his things, as though he'd come back from being eaten in his own yard and be upset about missing diesel. But I left it, because the note was not for Earl. The note was for me. The note was evidence that I was still the kind of man who left notes, and if I stopped being that man, I wasn't sure what man would replace him. Day 29 was when the dark came in, and by dark, I don't mean nightfall. A group appeared on 1600 at midday. 6 adults, 1 pickup truck, approaching from the north. Nolan spotted them from the bell tower of the church, where he'd been running afternoon observation. He jogged back to the house. The man ran a half-mile in boots on a gravel road without breathing hard, which at 53 was either admirable or infuriating, and told us to stay quiet. They stopped at the Pruitt farm first. We heard the chainsaw start from a half-mile away. They were taking what we hadn't. Fine. Then they drove on, slow, scanning. They stopped at my driveway. Their leader, the word feels too generous, but I don't have a better one, was a man named Garrett. I learned his name later. Right then, he was just a voice calling from the road while I stood inside my kitchen with the Remington and a mouthful of copper taste. Hey, in the house. We're not looking for trouble. Just checking on folks. You got water? Power? Nolan, beside me, whispered, "Do not answer." But Maggie was visible. She'd been on the porch when they appeared, and she'd frozen instead of coming inside. And they'd seen her. A teenage girl. The calculus of that visibility in a world without law is something I will not elaborate on, because the elaboration would make me say things I cannot take back. I went out on the porch. I had the Remington, but I held it pointed down, the way you hold a sentence you haven't decided to finish. Garrett was mid-40s, lean, sunburned, wearing a Carhartt vest and a holstered pistol that he hadn't drawn, which was the only reason I was talking instead of shooting. "We're fine," I said. "Appreciate you checking." He looked at the fence, the plywood on the windows, the supplies visible through the garage door I'd left half open because I am not, as previously established, a tactical genius. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that contains mathematics. "Good setup," he said. "Smart. You military?" "Plumber." He nodded like that was funny. Then he said the thing that changed the next 72 hours. "We've got a camp set up near the interstate. 35 people. We're consolidating resources. Makes more sense to pool than to scatter, right? Safety in numbers. You should bring your people over. Especially the girl. We've got other kids. She wouldn't be alone." Every word was reasonable. Every word was true, probably. Safety in numbers is not a lie. Pooling resources is not a lie. The problem was the smile. The problem was the way his eyes had moved across my property with the efficiency of an appraiser. The problem was that he'd mentioned Maggie specifically, and mentioning a child specifically is never casual. I told him we were fine. He said to think about it. He left a hand-drawn map wedged in my mailbox. I watched the truck drive south until it was gone, and then I turned around, and Nolan was standing in the doorway, and his face said everything his voice didn't need to. "We moved to the church tonight," he said. We moved to the church that night. 4 trips with the truck, headlights off. Navigating by moonlight and memory. Rice, beans, canned goods, water containers, medical kit, ammunition, tools, blankets, propane cylinders, Doug. Everything we could carry. The church basement was cold and smelled like hymnals and chalk. And Josie and Maggie set up sleeping areas with the efficiency of people who have learned that efficiency is a form of prayer. I went back to the house alone for a final load. It was nearly midnight. I was carrying the last propane cylinder from the garage when I heard footsteps on the gravel that were not human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong. Too regular. No variation in pace. Like a metronome made of bone. 2 of them came around the corner of the house. The moonlight was strong enough to see but weak enough to distort. And what the moonlight showed me was 2 figures moving with the mechanical insistence of wind-up toys whose springs had been wound past the point of reason. One had been a woman. One had been a teenage boy. Their clothes were Elizabethtown normal. The woman in scrubs, the boy in a hoodie with a high school logo I couldn't read. I had the Remington. 6 shells. 2 targets at 15 yards in closing. I fired twice. The first shot hit the woman's center mass and staggered her backward, and she did not fall. Double-aught buckshot at 15 yards will put a man on the ground. It did not put her on the ground. She rocked back and came forward again like a door that had been pushed and swung back. The second shot took the boy in the hip, and he went down, but he did not stop. He crawled, fast, fingers digging into the gravel, with a sound like someone raking a chalkboard. I fired again. The woman's head. She dropped. The boy's head. He stopped. I stood in my grandfather's yard with a shotgun that now held 2 shells and 2 bodies that had stopped being bodies sometime before I'd stopped them again. And the silence after gunfire at midnight in rural Kentucky is a specific kind of silence that has weight and texture, and it pressed against my eardrums like a thumb. I loaded the propane into the truck. I drove to the church. I did not tell Maggie what I'd done. Vera saw my face and poured me water from the jug and sat next to me on a Sunday school chair that was too small for adults. And we sat there in a basement that smelled like old paper and chalk. And she said, "The first one is the hardest. It doesn't get easy, but the hardest is behind you." She was right about the first part. She was wrong about the second. Day 31. The quarantine deadline Dale had predicted came and went. The roads stayed sealed. No cavalry, no helicopters, no government trucks with MREs and hope. Just silence from beyond the wire and chaos within it. Garrett came back. Not to the house. He'd found it empty, probably. But to the church. He appeared on the road below the hill with 3 of his people. On foot this time. And he stood in the churchyard and called up to the tower where Nolan was watching and said, "I know you're in there. I'm not an idiot." We tracked the tire marks. Nolan came down. We met Garrett at the churchyard gate, the 2 of us. And what followed was a conversation that I have replayed more times than any conversation in my life, including my marriage proposal and my divorce proceedings. Garrett said his group needed the church, the spring-fed well, the elevation, the defensible position. He said this with the politeness of a man who has already decided to take what he wants and is offering you the chance to hand it over with dignity. He said we could join his group and our supplies would be shared among everyone, or we could leave and go wherever we wanted. But the church was going to be his, because he had 30 people and I had 4. This was the dilemma, not a philosophical exercise, not a trolley problem on a whiteboard. A man with a gun and numbers standing in a churchyard, asking me to surrender the only safe position in a county full of the walking dead. Nolan wanted to fight. He said it quietly, after Garrett had given us an hour to decide, and his voice had the calm of someone who has done violence before and views it as a tool rather than a catastrophe. He said the bell tower gave us a shooting position they couldn't easily assault. He said 3 of Garrett's visible people were carrying hunting rifles, not military weapons, and their spacing was amateur. He said we could hold. And I asked him, hold for what? Hold until we've killed people who are alive in order to keep a building? Hold until Maggie watches me shoot someone's father? Vera was the one who found the third option. She said, what if we give them what they actually need and keep what we actually need? The well. That was what Garrett wanted. Water. His camp near the interstate had no reliable water source. They'd been collecting rainwater and scavenging bottles, and both were running out. The church had the spring-fed well, and that was the resource worth killing over. Vera suggested we offer to share the well. Open access. Garrett's people could come fill containers any time. In exchange, our group maintained residence in the church, and Garrett's people stayed at their camp. Mutual non-aggression purchased through shared water. It was not a good plan. It was a plan that had 17 obvious failure modes, beginning with Garrett deciding to simply take the well and ending with his people casing the church from the inside during water runs. Nolan listed the failure modes with the exhaustiveness of a man who has written after-action reports. Then he said, "It's still better than shooting people." And I realized Nolan had never wanted to fight. He'd wanted to know that I understood the cost of not fighting, so that when I chose not to fight, I chose with open eyes. I told Garrett. He accepted. He accepted too quickly, which worried me. But the alternative to a worrying peace was a certain war, and I chose worry. The arrangement held for 11 days. Garrett's people came for water every morning and evening. 2 at a time, armed but not aggressive, filling jugs and 5-gallon buckets from the pump Nolan had rigged over the spring cap. They nodded at us. We nodded at them. Doug sniffed them with the professional thoroughness of a building inspector. On day 42, one of Garrett's people, a woman named Shonda, who'd started lingering after filling her jugs, talking to Vera about medical things, rubbing Doug behind his ears. told us that Garrett's camp was fracturing. 3 families had left, heading south toward the county line, hoping to talk their way through the military perimeter. 2 men had gotten into a fight over a generator that had turned into a knife fight, that had turned into 1 man bleeding out on the pavement of an I-65 overpass. Garrett was holding his group together with charisma and resource control, and both were depleting. I asked Shonda if she wanted to stay at the church. She looked at me like I'd offered her something she'd stopped believing existed. Then she said no. She said Garrett had her brother, not captive. Nothing that clean, just dependent. Her brother was diabetic, type 2, managed with metformin. But the metformin was almost gone, and Garrett had the only remaining supply because Garrett had raided a Walgreens on North Dixie during the first week. Her brother stayed because of the pills. She stayed because of her brother. This was the second dilemma, and it was worse than the first. We had medical supplies. Vera's haul from Hardin Memorial included metformin. Not much. Maybe a 60-day supply at standard dosing. If we gave it to Shonda for her brother, we surrendered leverage we might need and medication that might save someone in our own group. If we kept it, we left a man dependent on someone who used medicine as a leash. Vera said, I didn't take an oath to hoard. Nolan said, if Garrett finds out we had what he's been using as control, he'll see us as a threat. Both right, both irreconcilable. I gave Shonda the metformin. All of it. She cried in a way that had no sound, just her face collapsing and rebuilding, and she put the bottles inside her jacket and walked down the hill, and I watched her go. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who has made a decision he cannot reverse, that I had just changed something I could not predict. 3 days later, Garrett arrived at the church with 8 people. Not for water, for confrontation. Shonda's brother had shown him the metformin. Garrett understood what it meant. That we had medical supplies we hadn't disclosed. That the power balance was not what he'd assumed. He stood in the churchyard, and he did not smile this time. You've been holding out, he said. We shared our water, I said. Water's not medicine. Medicine is power. You knew that. He was right. I had known that. What happened next took 4 minutes and restructured everything. Nolan was in the bell tower. Josie with her splinted arm and her iron and her silence about Vine Grove, was at the basement entrance. Vera and Maggie were inside. I was at the gate, alone, facing a man who had decided I was an obstacle. Garrett reached for his holster, not fast, deliberate, the way you reach for something when you want the reaching to be seen. And Josie's voice came from behind the stone wall to his left, flat and clear, and carrying a weight I hadn't heard from her before. I watched a man turn in a living room 6 feet from where I was sitting, and I beat him with a tire iron until he stopped moving. And it took a long time for him to stop. If you pull that weapon, I will not hesitate the way I hesitated with him. Garrett looked at her. A 17-year-old girl with a broken arm and a tire iron, and eyes that were telling the truth. He looked at the bell tower, where Nolan was visible with the Glock. He looked at me. Then he took his hand away from the holster, and he said, "Keep your church," and walked down the hill with his people, and Shonda was not among them, and neither was her brother. They arrived at the church that evening. Shonda and Marcus, her brother, with 2 backpacks and a gratitude so large it didn't fit into language. I want to tell you it ended cleanly. It didn't. Endings don't. They fray. Garrett's group dissolved over the following week. Some joined us at the church. 2 more families, bringing our number to 11, which was more than I'd planned for, but fewer than the well could support. Some left the county, some didn't make it. On day 53, a military helicopter flew over Cecilia, low enough to read markings. National Guard. It circled twice and dropped leaflets that said a relief corridor would open on the southern county line in 72 hours. Medical screening required. Infected individuals would be quarantined. Non-infected would be evacuated to a processing center in Bardstown. Nolan didn't believe it. He said it could be a consolidation trap. gathered the survivors in one location for easier management, or worse. His paranoia was not baseless. But Vera talked to him for a long time. The two of them sitting in the churchyard while the sun went down. And I don't know what she said, but when she came back inside, she told me Nolan would go. We packed. The rice was nearly gone. 8 pounds remaining from the original 400. The propane was exhausted. The well still ran clean and cold, the one resource that had never diminished, the one thing that had purchased peace and then nearly purchased war. The drive to the southern county line took 2 hours because we went slow, scanning, stopping at every intersection to let Nolan clear the road ahead. Doug rode in Maggie's lap. Josie sat next to them with the tire iron across her knees. Vera rode with Shonda and Marcus in the Camry. The church got smaller in the rearview mirror, and I watched it go, and felt a grief that made no sense for a building I'd known for 53 days. But sense is not the currency grief trades in. The checkpoint was real. Soldiers in full protective gear, medical tents, the organized chaos of a system that was functioning, if not thriving. They screened us one at a time. Blood draws, temperature checks, pupil response tests. It took 6 hours. Doug barked at a soldier, and Maggie apologized, and the soldier knelt down and scratched Doug's ears and said, "My mom has a beagle." And Maggie started crying. Not about the beagle. They let us through. All of us. Even the ones Garrett had held. Even Josie, who they questioned for 45 minutes about the arm and about Vine Grove, and who answered every question with the same flat specificity she'd used to describe it to me. On the other side of the wire, there were buses, white buses with Red Cross markings, idling in a line on a lane road in the Kentucky hills, and the normalcy of buses. The absolute ordinary mundane reality of a vehicle designed to move people in bulk broke something in me that the zombies hadn't reached. I sat on the ground next to bus 7 and put my face against the cool metal of the wheel well and breathed. Doug licked my hand. Maggie sat down next to me. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on Doug's back, and Doug's tail thumped once against the asphalt. And the sound of it, that specific, stupid, irreplaceable sound of a dog's tail on pavement, was the realest thing I'd heard in 53 days. Vera came over. She had her composition notebook in her hand, the one with every bandage and every ibuprofen and every alcohol swab logged in her perfect handwriting. She tore out the last page. It was blank. She handed it to me. "For the next list," she said, "whenever you're ready." I put the blank page in my pocket. I still have it. I keep it in the same pocket where I used to keep work orders. Folded in thirds, slightly damp from proximity to the body, carrying the specific weight of something that means more than the material it's made from. We boarded the bus. Maggie took the window seat. Doug curled under her legs. Nolan sat across the aisle and fell asleep before the bus moved, which was the first time I'd seen him close his eyes in 30 days. Josie sat in the back row alone, and I let her, because some people need the back row. And knowing when to leave someone alone is a form of care that doesn't get enough credit. The bus pulled onto the road. The checkpoint receded. The wire, the county, the church on the hill with the spring-fed well that had kept us alive and almost gotten us killed, all of it getting smaller. All of it staying exactly the same size inside me, where distance doesn't work the way it works in the physical world. Vera sat down next to me. She smelled like chalk and hand sanitizer and the lavender soap she'd rationed so carefully it had lasted the entire 53 days. One thin slice of normal in a world that had forgotten the word. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The bus rumbled south, and the Kentucky hills rolled past, golden and indifferent, and Doug's tail thumped once more against the floor. And that was enough. That was enough. I wrote this story because I couldn't stop thinking about the people who never make the news. Every disaster narrative focuses on the heroes or the villains, the lone wolf with the arsenal. the tyrant consolidating power. But most people in a crisis are neither. They're plumbers, they're nurses, they're 17-year-olds who survive something and then have to keep surviving it every day in their own heads. They're people whose most heroic act is opening a door when every rational calculation says to keep it shut. Hardin County is real. The geography is real. The limestone karst, the well depths, the roads, the distances. I check them because I believe you deserve a story that holds up when you Google it. The calorie math is real. The ammunition counts are real. The hand pump specifications are real. The world earned your trust, or it didn't. And I hope it did. 3 questions I'd genuinely like to hear your answers to. First, Owen gave all the metformin to Shonda, leaving his group with none, if someone in his group had later needed it. Say Vera developed diabetes from the stress and dietary changes. Would that act of generosity have become an act of negligence? Where's the line between compassion and responsibility when supplies are finite? Second, if you had 30 days of warning and roughly $11,000, what would your first 3 purchases be, and why? Not your fantasy list, your real list, based on where you actually live, right now, with the skills you actually have. Third, Josie never told her full story about what happened in Vine Grove. Owen never pushed her to. Do we owe the people who shelter us our stories? Or is silence its own form of honesty, a way of saying, I am not ready, and I trust you to accept that? Thank you for listening. Genuinely. 3 hours of your attention is not nothing. It's one of the most human things you can offer another person. And I don't take it lightly. I hope Owen and Maggie and Vera and Nolan and Josie and Doug felt real to you. I hope they stay for a while after the audio ends. That's all any storyteller can ask. Take care of each other. Leave the note on the workbench. Open the door.